Hey, folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. We are in short order back in Tennessee. We recently recorded with our friends over at Chattanooga Whiskey. And today we're thrilled to bring you another Tennessee distillery that I got to visit back on my trip in, 2022. Seems like so long ago, but got to visit, got to hang out for an inordinate amount of time with Hemingway, the polydactyl cat. And to talk about, I'm talking, of course, about Leiper's Fork Distillery. And to talk about Leiper's Fork, we've got on Lee Kennedy. He's the owner, founder, uh, head distiller, still
Yeah,
or
a head
original
head
distiller,
distiller. Yep,
head
yep, yep.
distiller. And so, Lee, welcome on.
Absolutely, David. Thank you for having me. Glad to be a part of it. And I know you had talked to the folks down at Chattanooga, so that's really great. Thanks for including us in the conversation as well. But happy to be here.
Absolutely, got to shine a light on those in Tennessee, not named George or Jack. Uh,
Absolutely.
so let's before we get into the nitty gritty details, let's just start with the general thing. What's the origin story for Leiper's Fork?
Yeah, well, anybody who's heard me or seen me on other podcasts or whatever probably heard this before. But as a teenager, I was kind of a weird teenager. Loved history and all things about it and all the rest of it. And and that kind of historical context of whiskey initially captured my imagination. The fact that Scots-Irish folks came over to the New World and brought the technology and the know-how with them. They had different grains in the form of Native American maize versus barley, like they had originally from the old country, and were able to start a thriving whiskey industry. So that just the kind of the mystique of a little bit of of moonshine production also kind of captured my initial interest. And like I said, as a 17-year-old, and I had an uncle who actually dabbled and I'm talking about the mid '90s. So there was no YouTube around, no internet, and very little literature on the subject. And if there was literature, it tended to be very archaic and hard to disseminate. So had an uncle who dabbled in it a little bit, and actually as a 17-year-old kid, I built a little still in my mom's basement out of a 5-gallon pressure cooker from Sears and some copper condensing line from Home Depot, and a 5-gallon bucket was my condenser, and learned just enough to be dangerous. But that kind of I developed a passion and really just an interest in the industry and what I called kind of the backwoods chemistry of whiskey production, and kind of shelved that when I went to college and moved back to Tennessee after college. And at that point, I was actually in financial services, but I was doing some home distilling at home, and it was just anything I could get at that point. Obviously, the internet was around. There was literature written on the subject, and I just devoured anything I could on the subject of whiskey production and the rest of it. And so, really did that at home as a barn distiller, really from 2002 till our law changed in Tennessee in 2009. And so in 2000 and really 2010, 2011, started putting pen to paper. I knew this was something that I would like to pursue professionally, and just wanted to make sure that the industry penciled out and everything was viable. It's one thing to turn your passion into your business, but it needs to be, you don't want to spend $100 to make one. And so everything penciled out, and I started, approached my county government here in January of 2012, and got our building. We had to go through 3 public hearings. We had to change the law in our county that actually went
Mhm.
back to prohibition, and took 3 years to do that. And so we got our building permit in January of 2015 and started producing. We made our first barrel in April of 2016.
And since then, you're let's see, you've gone through a name change since then because it was Hillsborough
Yeah,
originally.
well, the town of Leiper's Fork, back in the old days. When I say old days, I mean 1820.
Mhm.
So, but before the little village where we're at was called Leiper's Fork, it was called Hillsborough. And this is just a little bit of the nuance of history, but they were establishing the mail service back in the 1820s in Tennessee, and you couldn't have 2 towns in the same state with a post office named the same. So that prompted a name change from Hillsborough to Leiper's Fork. but all of the old timers, my granddad included, who's now passed, always referred to it as Hillsboro. And so, kind of things die hard here in the South. And so, that name has stuck around. You drive around Nashville. We sit about 45 minutes south of Nashville, but you see Hillsboro Road, Old Hillsboro Road. And a lot of the people don't know what that is in reference to, but it's actually the original name for Leiper's Fort. So, but yeah, it's all, our distillery has always been Leiper's Fork Distillery. I wanted to, tie it to a sense of place, and my family on my mom's side, the Locke family, they've been in Leiper's Fork since 1805. So just, there were a lot of reasons why I wanted to name the distillery that, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think just looking through the history of the distillery, the interviews that you've done before, something that kind of stands out, and you mentioned it already, is you tend to celebrate a little more than others the connection to the Scots-Irish history.
Yeah.
And I kind of like that. It's this idea that the Scots-Irish were coming over to what's now the U.S. and then moving further inland west, escaping English persecution and for more opportunity, etc. But not a lot of distilleries, and I'm talking heritage or new wave distilleries, really talk about that very much. So, obviously you've got the family connection with,
Sure. But
but
yeah, and that's true. Being a lover of whiskey production and of history, I kind of wove those two things together. But obviously, there's that's based in fact and in history. So, if you look at the origins of whiskey, it's developed. The more, and this is going down a rabbit hole a little bit. Edit this out if you want to, but going down the rabbit hole a little bit. Distillation was first invented by the Greeks, which they say actually probably came from the Egyptians, and they weren't really distilling alcohol. They were distilling perfumes and different elixirs and things like that, in the realm of alchemy. And so the Moors in the early medieval times, had invaded Europe. And so they brought that distilling technology with them. They had conquered, all of Spain, Italy, southern France. And so, like I said, they were, and actually alcohol is an Arabic word, but they were distilling perfumes and things like that. So there was a rubbing of technology, a sharing of technology and information between Christian monks and the Moors, and so Irish and Scottish monks took a still back to, and the technology and know-how back to Scotland and Ireland, and distilled beer in it, which became whiskey. And so that's kind of the origin story of that. Of course, monks in France and in Europe as well had been distilling brandy, before whiskey was made, obviously made out of distilled from wine. But so, as people, came to the New World, and so in Scotland and Ireland, that whiskey production and know-how became woven and into the cultural fabric of those communities. It was just part of what they did. And so, obviously, as they came to the New World, they brought that technology with them. A lot of them brought their stills with them. And so, the first reference to what will become bourbon actually happened in the Jamestown settlement around 1620. I think his last name for sure was Thorpe. Was writing back to a colleague in the UK, saying he had made a fine corn brandy out of Native American maize. And so that was really the first allusions to what would become bourbon, which is a corn-based distillate. And really that tied to the Scots-Irish. Like if you look at the Whiskey Rebellion, I think of 1797, somewhere around in there, those were Scots-Irish settlers that were on the western frontier of Pennsylvania. They took Scots-Irish people that tended to be kind of warlike and militaristic and moved them to the frontier as a buffer against justifiably, hostile natives. And so they started distilling rye whiskey there. And so that culture, that distilling culture amongst the Scots-Irish was very heavy. And if you look at the distilling history of Tennessee, most of the early players of distilling tended to be Scots-Irish. Of course, as the Industrial Revolution came along and different immigrants came into the country, like the Germans. So, like if you take Jim Beam, for example, Beam was originally as a German name, not spelled like it is now. And so the Germans with their industriousness, and all the rest of it, kind of took it to a different scale. But it was planted in America by the Scots-Irish, and so we try to give a nod to that. My family has that lineage as well, so it's something that we're proud of. And obviously, places like Tennessee and Kentucky, and now there's distilling going on all over the world. But until the last 20 years, when you thought about whiskey, you thought about Scotland, Ireland, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Japan's been making great whiskeys for a long time. Now you see a single malt explosion on the west coast of the U.S. But traditionally, those four regions were the primary whiskey making regions of the world, and a lot of that was because of the cultural heritage of those people and their know-how and just how ingrained it was in their society.
And so for your let's say more personal history, there was something that came up in the in Hard Proof. This was in 2019 about the Foxfire book series.
Yeah.
So this was something I was not familiar with at all. I had to look it up, but you said it was whiskey making is a fine art and had, as you said earlier, the archaic language, but you were able to build a still from it.
Sure.
So what is this book series?
So the Foxfire books are 12 volume series of books, and they were written by a professor, I want to say in the 1940s. And so and I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he traveled to Appalachia and lived there. And while he was there, he cataloged the know-how of the Appalachian people. And that was anything from hog dressing to log cabin building to folk medicine, you name it, it's in this book. And so in the first volume of that series, there's a chapter called Moonshining as a Fine Art. And it has some very archaic language in it, but I was able to, some of my first recipes were gleaned from that book. And like I said, I learned just enough to be dangerous and didn't kill anybody or blow anything up, but it really just kind of spurred a passion in me. And so, but like I said, back in the 90s, before there was any kind of meaningful literature written on the subject, and before the advent of the internet, people kind of had to turn to those, kind of less known sources to try to glean some information. And so that's what I was able to do as a 17-year-old. But yeah, definitely not the way went about it. I would go about it now, but yeah. So as we were getting the distillery off the ground, I tell people the science behind distilling, whether you're distilling in a 1 gallon pot or a 1,000 gallon still, the science and the chemistry is still the same. So I was spending about 1 week of every month in Kentucky distilling with another distillery up there, just kind of flattening the learning curve on using commercial and professional equipment, and making sure that I was setting myself up for success before we got the distillery operational.
And that was with the Wilderness Trail, right?
Yeah, spent a lot of time with Wilderness Trail. Pulled a lot of plays out of their playbook as we were starting the distillery. We can get into some of that, but yeah, Shane Baker and Pat Heiss, man, they're great guys, and I call them the wizards, the whiskey wizards, and they've helped a lot of people in the industry and were integral in helping us get our kind of processes dialed in and the distillery up and running for sure.
And I should say, I'm this jumping ahead a little bit. So I had heard that you had trained a little bit with Wilderness Trail and obviously had your own history of playing around and figuring it out yourself. Jumping ahead to when you made your first distillate at the distillery, I think on Dad's Drinking Bourbon, you said the first distillate that came off, you guys drew straws to see who would be brave enough to taste it. So was that a lack of confidence that it was going to be good? Was it something else there?
Yeah, I can't remember saying that, but I don't remember that actually being the case. We knew that when we got up and running, we were going to make good distillate, and our grain bills were a little bit experimental at the beginning. The first thing we actually ran through the still, this might have been what I was referencing, is this was the first time we actually turned steam onto the still, and we went to the local package store distributorship and bought cases of the cheapest vodka they had and brought that down to about 20% alcohol by volume and ran that through the still. I could have been referencing that, but no, everything's, since batch one, I was sending a lot of distillate to Kentucky with different grain bills when we were getting going. And, the feedback I was getting from them was, hey, you've got great whiskey coming off the still, just pick a style and go with it. And, you can't take bad whiskey and put it in a barrel and expect it to be rectified over its maturation time. So the philosophy being good in, good out. But it's kind of fun at the beginning, getting everything going and doing some experimenting that was a special time at the distillery for sure.
So the distillery gets up and running, and just because we've talked to Chattanooga so recently, we'll skip over the more details about the legislation in 09 and 13, and
Yeah,
of course, as you said, the public hearings, because there was a couple of distilleries like Chattanooga have had similar experiences in having to get their counties to go wet after
sure.
100 years or a little under 100 years. So I want to jump to when I was there. So this was end of August 2022, and I'm pretty sure Leiper's Fork was the second to last distillery on my tour, and it was just me driving around and visiting as many places as I could. And I remember driving up, and it was kind of a quiet road. You make a turn, and then suddenly you turn to the parking lot, and suddenly you see this beautiful property. I would say beautiful distillery, but it's really more than that. It's two beautiful buildings, log cabin, space in between that's nice for the outdoor space again, where I was hanging out with Hemingway. And it felt like something that was purpose built to be experiential and not just industrial, not just to produce. So
Yeah, that's very true, and I'm glad that you picked up on that. And some of that happened by accident. I was fortunate to have that property. I bought the property where the distillery sits, and we sit on 30 acres in Leiper's Fork. We're surrounded by horse farms and rolling hills. It's very iconic Middle Tennessee topography and all the rest of it. So I actually bought the 30 acres where the distillery sits as I was graduating college, and with the intent of building a house there, and subsequently got married, and my wife and I found a different farm that's not far from the distillery, about 4 miles. And so I had this piece of property, and actually during the '08 recession, I had that property for sale for a price that it wouldn't be on the market for a few minutes now, but never had any takers. And so, as I approached Williamson County, and Williamson County, they adopted the law, unlike Hamilton County, where Chattanooga is straight away. Our county kind of has a lot of regulatory hurdles to jump through, and they said, "Hey, we don't mind you doing this. We just don't have a law that would allow you to operate." So it was more so about creating the law that we're now operating under. But as we were going through that process, I knew I wanted to distill whiskey in a rural setting, and kind of going back to some of that history. As we both probably know, we try whiskey has become this big global phenomenon, and we try to turn it into this big sexy kind of thing. But the origins of whiskey are very humble. It's really a farm beverage produced by farmers with their excess crop yield. And so I always kind of like that rural and agrarian nature of whiskey production. So I knew when I decided that I was going to pursue this as a business, I didn't want to. I could have saved myself a lot of time and probably money if I'd gone into an industrial setting. But I didn't want to. I didn't want to make whiskey next to somebody making plastics or something like that. So, to be able to preserve the rural character of what we were doing, we went through the motions of getting the piece of property approved for the distillery and all the rest of it. And so, a lot of it was by design. Me, loving history the way I do. I love these old log cabins that are so iconic to Tennessee. And so a 2,500 square foot cabin, as you said, kind of anchors our retail space, tasting with some offices upstairs. And then our still house sits behind the retail cabin in a mortise and tenon building. It's all the building is pegged together the way it was, the very old school kind of building techniques. And so I didn't anticipate a lot of tourism when we started the distillery. In one way, when I was creating the distillery and coming up with this idea, I thought I was in hindsight, I was in this bubble. I thought I was the only person doing that, and really didn't realize it until the 2009 law change that other people were really considering doing the same thing. And so when I built the business on paper, my uncle's my CFO. We're all family owned. We don't have any corporate money behind us. We bootstrapped everything. And so when we designed the distillery on paper and building the financial modeling for it, we didn't factor in any money from tourism as far as on-site bottle sales, hospitality, and tours and whatnot. And we wanted to be in the whiskey business, not the tourism business. But we were kind of naive in that regard because it's become a really good revenue stream as far as the tourism and on-site bottle sales, which has helped us get us into the black. So I feel like we kind of sit on a campus, like you said, and what we've tried to do kind of by accident is create a little bit of a reality distortion for visitors when they come. When they come to the distillery, we want them to arrive as guests, but kind of leave as friends and family. And so I feel like the setting in which we do that kind of takes them out of their day-to-day grind. And so we have a kind of an old world feel at the distillery, and it's a cool setting. We're not an industrial setting. We're, like I said, sit on 30 acres. So it's kind of a unique space.
And I mean, you started distilling in April of 2016, and then the rest of the structures came online later in the year, open to the public 6 months later in October of that year. So I'm curious then, from the business plan to implementation, it seems like just by the dates alone, it seems like pretty quickly you realized that tourism was going to be something that you had to look at and had to incorporate.
Yeah, and kind of that's just happened as far as the way the construction fell at the distillery. We built our still house simultaneously as we were building our log cabin to hold, like I said, the retail and the tasting. The still house went a lot quicker than the retail cabin did, and the office space and retail. So we actually were distilling in our space without any doors on it. And the reason, we were chomping at the bit so badly to get going that, we started distilling straight away in April. And like you said, you've done your homework. We didn't officially open to the public until October, when we had our grand opening with the retail cabin online. And really, we, as far as speaking on the tourism, we were hoping to see 10,000 visitors, paid tours in the first 3 to 4 years, and we hit that handily in our first year. We see close to 30,000 paid tours per year, not including people just coming in off the street doing a tasting, and that's people coming in laying money down for a proper tour. But so and a lot of that is an offshoot of what's going on in Nashville. We've been fortunate to take advantage of just the draw that Middle Tennessee has gotten because of Nashville and all the rest of it. So it's been a good thing for us. And we see, that 30,000 people, put that in perspective, down in Lynchburg, they'll see, close to 500,000 people a year. But it really helps us. It's really helped our bottom line. I think I mentioned earlier, we got in the black in February of 2020. And that was in a large part due to our tourist volume and on-site sales and all the rest of it.
What a time to hit the black in February 2020.
Yeah, just in time for the pandemic. That was a wild time.
As you mentioned, Leiper's Fork, I think I saw on your website actually that it's considered Nashville area's #1 art destination.
It is.
So, and I appreciated this also going to the website. Some websites are very sparse and not a lot of information on there, but I appreciated the fact that you and the team have put suggestions for other places you can visit. Come to Leiper's Fork Distillery, do the tour, taste, look around, enjoy the tourism aspect there, but also here are some local businesses that you should also visit while you're here. Some restaurants, some shops. And to me, this is something that I've been seeing more of, and I appreciate, but I've been seeing a lot of in places like rural or remote Scotland. You know, just the other day I was speaking to Isle of Harris in Scotland, and they're well, now you can fly there. You can take a short flight there. You can take the ferry, but I mean, it's still Outer Hebrides. It's pretty remote,
Sure.
and so they can't just be a distillery. You know, they have to be a destination point plus all these things around it, but it benefits everybody at the same time.
Mhm.
So you said the county didn't give you much trouble in deciding to let you go ahead. Was there what was the community's initial response, and has it changed?
So the community response was great, and so mentioning Leiper's Fort, the village there, that's what folks call it. It's an eclectic little spot. It has a lot of elements of Mayberry. There's some art galleries there. Um, a great live music venue called Fox and Lock, which was originally called Puckett's. And it's become a tourist destination. Almost kind of by accident, to be honest with you. I mean, we have a lot of country music artists that live in and around the area, and so there's just we try to provide somewhere. We try to provide folks with. We want them to come see the distillery, but we're also part of a bigger community, and so we want to support the rest of our small businesses in the village. And so a lot of those business owners, like Lisa Fox at Leapers Creek Gallery, she stood up for me in public hearings and spoke for me. And all of my neighbors, I knew almost all of my neighbors, having owned that property for so long. And so before I approached the county, I actually sat on all of their couches and said, "Hey, this is what I want to do. What's your thoughts?" And so they all supported me, which is a great thing to have, especially going into those public hearings. And so we've got a great relationship with our community and our neighbors. It's we try to keep our little bit of our on the weekends. We have a little bit of porch picking. We try to keep that down, not to disturb anybody's peace. But yeah, so it's been a fun ride, and the community has embraced us for sure.
Love to hear it. So, just actually, this is jumping ahead again, but when you recorded with Dad's Drinking Bourbon, this was in May 2019. So this was, when you had, I think it was about 25,000 people that year coming in, and now you got 30,000, that's fantastic. It means you've recovered post COVID. So I guess I was going to ask, like, during that recording, I think it was on site, and I remember writing down in my notes that it sounded very like busy in a good way, that you wanted to
Yeah.
sound in the background like there's a lot going on, there's people visiting, all that. And it sounds like post COVID you've fully recovered from the setback.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember that podcast with John from Dad's Drinking Bourbon, and at our retail cabin. Our offices are upstairs, and so this is only a 2,500 square foot cabin, downstairs. So it's fairly small, and the noise filters upstairs, and we don't have any doors upstairs, so it can get a little loud, and they were good to kind of roll with that. And I think John made some jokes about it, but that's the sound of money being made downstairs, which is always a good thing. But yeah, we've recovered nicely, and we actually, speaking to that, we're kind of a segue. We're designing our barrel house right now, and when we went through the approval process with the county, one of the things that we did was have our barrel house went ahead and got that approved, and so we're in the design phase of it right now. And when we build that, it'll be kind of a dual purpose building. We'll store barrels in it, obviously, but we'll also have some office space and an additional tasting room. And we're going to move all of our processing, meaning post maturation processing, dumping harvesting barrels, and filtering and going into bottle out there. So, but we've outgrown our spot, our buildings tremendously already, which is a good thing. But we're really small. We make 25,000 gallons of whiskey per year. That's roughly 500 barrels. And again, a little bit of perspective, down in Lynchburg, they're making 125,000 gallons a day. So it'll take us 5 years what they make in a single day. But that's not our reason for being. And so but even though we're making small amounts of whiskey, we've still outgrown a lot of our buildings. So it'll be great when we can finally put a shovel in the ground and get that barrel house started.
Enough. And with the, I think it's a good intro to your production style, which is not as, how do I put this? Not as traditionally American as one might expect. So, for example, you have a Vendome still.
Mm-hmm.
It's a 500-gallon pot still, but it's in well, this from my viewpoint in looking at the pictures, it seems Scottish style.
Yes.
Uh, it has the line arm in the same way. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's a worm tub condenser, although it could be shell and tube. I wasn't sure
It
from the
is.
picture.
It's shell and tube.
It is shell and tube, but still more Scottish style as opposed to a, if you will, bourbon-esque style pot still with the reflux bulb and all that. So, what
Mm-hmm.
as you were deciding which direction to go, you have the family history of the Scots-Irish. You want to create a certain style, if you will. What drove you towards having Vendome, an American builder, build you a Scottish style still?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and I had some preconceived notions as I was opening or starting the distillery, just because of my background. And so one of the things I actually reached out to Forsyth, which is the most reputable steel maker in Scotland, out of Elgin, Scotland. And I was going to have a traditional Scottish wine neck still be built by Forsyth. And at the time, back in 2014, 2015, they had about a 2.5 year lead time. And so the most reputable steel manufacturer in the U.S. being Vendome, have been building stills in Louisville, Kentucky since I want to say like 1893. I called them and they had a year lead time during that period. And so I talked with them through what I was looking for in a still. I wanted to run a pot still, that was my background. And kind of being true to history, the column still was, as I'm sure you're aware, was built was originally conceived in the 1850s by an Irishman named Aeneas Coffey, and he initially designed column stills for the gin market in London, and it was a more efficient distilling method and all the rest of it. But I wanted to, so pre 1850, all the whiskey in the world ever made was made on a pot still. So it was important to me to have a pot still, and if we were going to design one, I wanted a Scottish swan neck pot still because of the traditional aspect of it, and because with a traditional line arm like used in single malt Scotch, you're going through a lot more. You're touching a lot more copper, and the Scottish have a saying that says something to the effect of the longer the conversation between the alcohol vapor and the copper, the softer the resulting spirit. And so we adding the Vendome had a pot still with a bulbous, and you're right, they have a 4-plate deflameter. We actually have a 4-plate deflameter, but that original design had that 4-plate deflameter directly over the bulbous. And so just my thoughts on distilling, it seemed like a very kind of violent distillation. You were forcing that alcohol vapor over versus kind of coaxing it over with a line arm and a Scottish swan neck. So we decided to add the Scottish swan neck, and so there was some discussion about the angle of our line arm. We wanted to
Sure.
put more of a drastic angle on it to make sure we weren't coming off the still too hot as far as our exit proof. And so we travel through about almost 25 feet of copper before we hit our 4-plate deflameter. So I think that gives our product a softness, our distillate of softness, and also a kind of a different character. But kind of going back to that single malt Scotch, I am a fan of Scottish distilleries and distillers, and I obviously, I tell people anywhere you're making whiskey in the world, you got to pay homage back to Scotland and Ireland. So, if a pot still is good enough for single malt Scotch, I felt like it was good for our application as well, which is a little different. You mentioned it earlier. It's most, especially the large legacy brands, they're made on column stills. Obviously, great whiskey coming off a column still. It's just a difference of opinion. And the American palate, as far as bourbon and Tennessee whiskey goes, has kind of been shaped by the column still. So one of the things that we try to talk about as a differentiation point is the fact that we're pot distilled. And a lot of people, because it's a pot distill produces a more robust distillate, you're carrying over more fusel oils and congeners by default of running a pot still. So that whiskey tends to have a more robust profile than a lot of column distilled whiskeys, which can be a little thinner. But it's just the way we approach the industry and what we do to kind of set ourselves apart.
I mean, at the time that you're thinking of creating this, let's say the late 2000s, and then putting the plan into place after the legislation changed, in the county that you're in, Williamson County, you had a fairly robust tradition of distilling there. It was something like 40 distilleries in the mid 1800s. Obviously, with Tennessee state prohibition in 1909. 1909,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It went into effect in 1910.
1910, right. It there was consolidation and then nothing for a while. But was there, while you wanted to pay homage to, like I said, to Scotland and Ireland and the whiskeys that you liked from there, did you was there consideration not necessarily for a column still, but for trying to recreate some of the old styles of whiskey that had existed in the area?
Yeah, a little bit, and I love that. Like I said, Tennessee has a rich and colorful history and complicated history when it comes to whiskey production in the state. If you look at, and I'm answering your question in a roundabout way, but if in 1896, there were 322, according to our industrial census, there were 322 distilleries in the state of Tennessee. And fast forward to 1910, well, actually, the headline of the Tennessean newspaper in December 31st of 1909, the headline was, "All distilleries and breweries must shut down at midnight tonight." And at that time, there were roughly around just over 40 distilleries listed in the state at that time. And so just from going from 1896 to 14 years later in 1910, to go from 322 distilleries down to 40 some odd distilleries, that was a major shakeout. A lot of those people had moved out of the state, but Tennessee has at its roots, it's always had distilling going on inside the state. So that was important to us, and that's one of the reasons that I say that we make a lot of things we do we call pre-prohibition style. We can kind of go through some of that, but not necessarily trying to mimic what another Tennessee brand was doing, but trying just to stay true to the traditions of the state. And if you look at those 322 distilleries in 1896, probably the lion's share of those people were running pot stills. And so we try to do things that are kind of throwback. I'd say that we're inefficient by design. Running a pot still is inefficient. It's a batch system. It's not a continuous run system. So a lot of the things we do is trying to do some of the things that were done pre-prohibition that tend to not be inefficient, but we feel like are what's right for the whiskey.
And one of those things, and I'll save that for when we get into the production in a couple of minutes. Again, as part of the creation process, this always fascinates me. You had, if I'm reading this right, you had several, let's say, mash bills that you went through on the bourbon side, the rye side, and the wheated bourbon side. What, and you said that in one of these, Stats Drink Bourbon, that you like alternative grain bills, you like playing around with a lot of these things.
So, we used to do that. Yeah, and actually our grain bills were it's kind of funny how well, first of all, I'm a contrarian by nature. And when I was I actually wasn't going to make a Tennessee whiskey. We were going to be only a Tennessee bourbon. At the time, there was no one really I thought of making a Tennessee bourbon in the state. And so I didn't want to do something because I was expected to or felt like I had to. And talking to Pat and Shane at Wilderness Trail, they're like, man, you've got to do a Tennessee whiskey. You're going to be doing yourself a disservice if you don't. And you can make bourbon in all 50 states. You can only make Tennessee whiskey in one. And so they're actually the reason that I actually did a Tennessee whiskey. And so the bourbon grain bill was almost kind of set in stone. I don't want to say set in stone, but it's the recipe that I was using before I got the distillery operational. So I knew I've always been a wheated bourbon guy, so I knew I wanted to create a wheated bourbon, and also a little bit of history of Williamson County. Prior to World War II, the Williamson County was the largest wheat producing county in our state. So used to grow a lot of wheat here. And so that was one reason that I did if you look at our logo, we've got our pot still that's front and center. That's actually on our label. That's the shop drawing of our still. And then we have a Blue Hours flower. That's the state flower of Tennessee. That other stalk is a stalk of wheat, which designates us as a wheated bourbon. So that grain bill was pretty static. The Tennessee whiskey grain bill changed very minimally. A matter of fact, our friends in Kentucky, which this would have been a great distiller's experiment, they wanted me to take our Tennessee whiskey grain bill and keep all things constant with our bourbon, except for the charcoal mellowing aspect, the sugar maple charcoal. Mm-hmm. And I thought about doing that, but the reason I didn't was I was nervous that there wouldn't be enough differentiation between those two products when they went on the shelf. So somebody walks into a package store, if the only thing different was that charcoal filtration, and they grabbed both bottles and they poured them side by side at home, I wanted there to be a distinct difference. And so, our grain bill on the bourbon is 70% corn, 15% wheat, 15% toasted barley malts, and we can get into that in a minute. But on our Tennessee whiskey, 15%, that 15% wheat got replaced with 15% rye and 15% toasted barley malt, obviously 70% corn. I did do a lot of experimentation with our rye grain bill. Rye was something I didn't anticipate making, but at the time when we started distilling, there were a lot of younger ryes on the market, and rye tends to pick up oxidation during maturation quicker than a corn-based distillate. And also consumers back then tended to be a little more forgiving on a younger rye coming to market than, say, a bourbon or a Tennessee whiskey. So the first thing we ever distilled at the distillery was actually rye. And we went through 7 different grain bills before we decided on one. They ranged from 100%, almost 100% rye down to 55% rye. And we actually ended up going with the 55. But that was a fun experiment, playing with those grain bills. But you mentioned playing around, and we actually are getting back to this, but we used to take the month of January and do very alternative grain bills. I actually made a triple distilled wheat whiskey in an Irish style that we've got a lot of that laying on wood. We've done malted corn, 100% malted corn distillate, 100% malted rye, 100% obviously malted barley. And so we used to experiment more than we do now. Now we take the month of January and half of February, which is our rye production. But we're trying to carve out a little as the brand is growing and looking at forecasting out, 5, 6, 7 years. We're realizing that every barrel of bourbon and Tennessee whiskey we lay down is going to be good for us. So it's really a balancing act between, scratching an itch when it comes to experimentation and and having enough product to be able to meet demand, if that makes sense.
No, for sure. And especially when you're only dealing with, your current output at 25,000 gallons annually, you're building up to that. There's only so much room within there to have what I think of as the products that drive the brand and that keep the lights on, and then the other ones that you can, the little capacity that you can play around with without detracting too much from the brands you need to, again, keep the lights on.
Absolutely.
I think you mentioned there was 100% malted corn whiskey. I think that must be a couple years old at this point. That went into a particular barrel, didn't it? particular barrel
Yeah,
type?
we had some of that whiskey. Some of it went into new cooperage. The lion's share of it went into used cooperage. Some of it, some very well known brands from Kentucky. And the thought process on that was, at the time the TTV didn't have, they had not determined what the definition was for American single malt. And so
Hmm.
technically, that is a single malt. It's from a single malted grain. And my intent was to call that a Southern single malt. And now with the TTV making their determination on the definition of single malt, American single malt, that's not going to work. But it was a very interesting. That's one of my favorite experiments that we've done, and we use our maltster that we use is Riverbend Malt House out of Asheville, North Carolina.
Hmm.
We grow grow our barley here in Williamson County. That's one of the things that we're kind of hell bent on doing is all of our grains that we use in our production process are grown within a 10-mile radius of the distillery, and we actually grow about a half of our own corn on our own property on a different farm. Um, so yeah, we love that experimentation, and that turned out really nicely. And I would say that distillate, especially the new make or white dog coming off the still, was almost had tassels of corn come to mind, cream corn a little bit, and that whiskey's actually it's been sitting on wood for about 5 years now. So yeah, next time you're down, we'll pull some of that. And my kind of my thought process is some of these experimental things we're going to let go for a while, and put some extra age on it, just because there's not any kind of pressure from a monetary standpoint for releasing that. So it'll be interesting to see. It's really phenomenal. I feel like right now that it's getting better with age, obviously.
And let's see, a couple ways I want to go with this. So building off of that, and with the mash bills themselves, you this is updated information, obviously, that you just said you have everything within 10-mile radius. You're at one point, obviously, when you were smaller, you were growing most of 75% of your own corn, but you
Yeah,
got bigger, so you needed a
yeah,
little extra. But that's still great that you can find it within 10 miles of the distillery. Uh, that's some kind of provenance that I would argue there for sure.
yeah.
uh and with the grains too, the barley component
Mhm.
fascinated me, because using this toasted Vienna style malt. And this was, I like referencing when I can to make sure I'm referencing the right people. This was Birdies and Bourbon back in April of 21. That you wanted the toasted aspect because you wanted to add a slightly smoky, a little bit toasted, that would pair well with the corn, settle some of the sweetness that corn can just be a really sweet distillate. Um, and you were at the time you were doing, let's see, a char three. No, you had tried a char four with a medium toast, char three with a heavy toast, and you're still playing around. Have you settled on a cask that you really like?
Not yet. Matter of fact, those when we first started, industry standard barrel at the time and probably now is the char four with a medium toast. And at that time, the stave age was probably less than 6 months on the stave age. We've now we're using char four, still medium toast with a stave age of which we try to get out to at least 18 months if we can, but not at least, but up to 18 months. It's been harder to do
Hmm.
with some of the cutbacks in production from a lot of the big boys. That's been easier to do now. But we kind of split our cooperage between the 4 char medium toast and a 3 char with a heavy toast. And really that kind of came about as our whiskey was turning 3 and 4. Obviously R&D in the industry is about that length of time.
Hmm.
And so as we were kind of analyzing how our distillate was interacting with wood, we made that determination to go to a number 3 char. So we're actually still playing around with that. I mean, we'll probably be just now this year releasing some of that 3 char whiskey. And initially, we'll probably start blending some of those together. But as that whiskey as we're looking at it now, we're probably going to go to a standard 3 char with a heavy toast, and that heavy toast is bringing out a lot of marzipan and marshmallow notes and things like that. Our whiskey coming off the still because of certain other processes we use like sweet mash and toasted barley malt. we have a very flavorful and robust whiskey. And so we feel like the number three char with that heavy toast is complementing our distillate in the best way. And going back a little bit to the toasted barley malt, that's one of the things that we're probably a little different from a lot of distilleries. We use 15% barley malt at least in everything that we do. I love the history and the process of malt and malting. Nothing as far as grains go, no fermentation doesn't happen without malt. And so most distilleries and distillers, they're using their malt as an enzyme grain, trying to get starch conversion from starch to sugar. And we actually view our malt as a flavoring grain, like you would your wheat or your rye. We pay more for that because it's a specialty malt. It is toasted. We mentioned that a minute ago. And so after the kind of the traditional two-step drying process of malt, Riverbend will take that malt and then they'll put it in a kiln and toast it. So it's actually a 6-row brewer's malt, but it's by toasting it, it's adding a dimension of character and profile to the whiskey that we wouldn't have otherwise. We pay more for it, but we feel like it's a good differentiation point for us. And when we first started distilling, we used different kinds of malts, and it just so happened, as that gave us what we felt like the most interesting spirit coming off our still with that addition of that toasted malt.
Using that barley for the malt for both flavor and enzymatic power.
Mm-hmm.
Normally I think of it's about 12%. It's kind of the minimum you need to have enough fermentation activity, enough enzymes in there to convert a whole batch. Anything below that, you got to supplement with enzymes, and some will supplement with enzymes even having a higher thing. Thought just occurred to me, do you lose any of that I'm blanking on the scientific word. Wow.
Diastatic power.
Thank you. Yes. Do you lose any of that diastatic power from the toasting process?
You may lose a little bit of it, but since we're using 15%, it would be very minimal. We're making that up. And you mentioned enzymes. We actually do use enzymes. So, when you're putting that, when you're introducing your corn, which is your first grain, if you're making bourbon, that's going to be introduced to your mash water. There's only really two ways of not having that corn turn into a big matzo ball on you, and that's either using what the industry calls sacrificial malt. So taking a little bit of your malt, sacrificing it for its alpha amylase, so that corn goes in very silky smooth and doesn't dough ball on you. And so we actually use outside liquid enzymes for that first step right before our corn goes in, to ensure that that's not going to dough ball on us. We do use a little bit of glucoamylase, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. I mean, basically, during that conversion, starch conversion to sugar, there's a little bit of dextrose that's converted, and so that glucoamylase allows us to blow those dextrose chains apart to give us more. For dextrose is not a fermentable sugar, so it gives us a little bit, about 20%. More fermentable sugar by blowing those dextrose chains apart. So we do use liquid amylase, liquid enzymes in accordance with our malt, but really that toasting for us is just, it's a flavoring grain component for us. I mean, that's pretty much strictly how we view it. There's more efficient ways and more cost-effective ways of getting that conversion. If we just order just a standard distiller's malt from Cargill, we'd be paying a hell of a lot less. But we feel like, it's using a smaller malt house it's doing some experimental things. It allows us, same way with our malt house, we're having seasonal conversations with our farmer. We actually use a farmer out of Franklin, Kentucky, which is right across the Tennessee state line. Sam Holcomb at Walnut Grove, they're farming about 3,000 acres of Williamson County here. And so it's been, we work hand in hand with our farmer to make sure that we're both on the same page of what we're looking for and all the rest of it. So it's, any distillery who's doing things grain to glass, they're probably all having these pretty detailed conversations with the folks that are providing, because it all starts with ingredient. Obviously, we want to start with the best ingredients.
Absolutely. And to in order to use those ingredients and keep that flavor, the pot still, I mean, I agree with you. There's great stuff coming off columns, but pot still just retains the flavors better, I think, especially again, as you said, it retains those oils,
Yeah,
the corn oils, the fusel oils. If it's not used right, the corn oils can burn, and that's, I think, unfortunately what this who said this? Oh, this was Lisa Roper Wicker said this, that she identified burnt corn oil as kind of that crafty note, if you will, that a lot of people don't like in young bourbons because they might be using a pot still to be heritage or whatever, but they're running it too hot
yes.
or and too high, so the oil burns and you can't get rid of that flavor. As you said, if you put bad stuff into the barrel's not going to fix it. So
And that
yeah,
note is very recognizable for sure. And
yeah.
we use we come to temperature pretty slowly, and then we have a pretty low distillation temperature as far as uh, we're not using a high pressure boiler. We use a low pressure boiler, and that helps us with not getting too out of control with our temperature. But you're exactly right. Like that note is very discernible, and obviously not something that you want to see.
No, not at all. It's unfortunate. I'm hoping that I don't know what the word is now, is a second wave, third wave of craft distilling now, that more people are attuned to that fact. They
Mm,
either go slower or lower or just something to avoid that flavor, because it's so off-putting that it defined a category for a while. As I said, it became a
absolutely.
craft note. It was like, this tastes crafty. And in the
Yeah, that's
same way
very
that we,
true.
in the same way we don't you like to use the word smooth or things like that. Like, it became
Yeah.
a word that just was all encompassing and unfortunately accurate a lot of the times.
Well, that's very true, and that's one reason. When I first started the distillery, I shied away from the term craft and kind of described our distillery as small batch. Obviously, small batch is an unregulated term. What small batch to me is not small batch to a large brand somewhere else. But some of those things that you talked about that were initially indicative of craft were sometimes a little bit of a faulty distillation, and other times it could have been the use of small cooperage, 25-gallon barrels,
Mhm.
where people are saying, you're going to speed your maturation or speed up aging, and that's not that you're going to speed up extraction and all the rest of it, but you're not going to speed up oxidation,
Yeah.
and which really breaks down whiskey and really kind of mellows it out. So we've never put anything into a 25-gallon barrel. Our deal is we want to make quality whiskey, simply and honestly, the same way the big boys are doing, except just on a small scale with our local resources. And so, there I tended to initially to kind of shy away because of the things you just mentioned that were going on in the quote unquote craft distilling world, which a lot of times we're cutting corners, and when you're in this industry, you can't cut corners, you can't rush time, and just you have to be patient in all aspects of the industry, whether that's financially or not rushing product to market. And so for a long time, I kind of shied away from that craft designation, to be honest with
It makes sense. It had a very negative connotation. And I think a large percentage of whiskey drinkers would say it still has somewhat of a negative connotation. It's
you.
getting
Hmm.
better for sure with just better techniques, as you said, but it created a problem for itself that it now has to overcome.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So, using the pot still, you're coming off at what I think is, and correct me if I'm wrong, this feels like a fairly low uh, percentage of coming off. You're coming out about 137 proof
Yeah,
still. So it's still, that's pretty full bodied, and then going into the barrel at 110, this pre-prohibition limit.
yeah.
Again, going back to the history, uh, was that was that anyone kind of telling you that this was something that you should do, or was it just, this is what we did historically and we want to honor that?
The low distillation proof kind of came from, and I don't want to mention names, to be honest with you, but
Sure, sure.
a well known distiller in Kentucky. Got to spend some time with him, and he's as a as a bar distiller or somebody who's doing this at home, your goal is to have everything is, and I know you don't like the word smooth, but have everything as neutral as you can coming off the still.
I
And when
mean,
things are
I'm
going,
okay with the word smooth if it's
yeah,
explained.
if it's
Yeah,
explained, right.
yeah.
So, having as neutral as you can distillate coming off the still for for consuming in its natural state with no barrel maturation. And so, I had to change my thought process. Knowing that we had distillate going into a barrel and maturing for years at a time, and so you getting to spend some time with with this gentleman. He said, your goal is to have a flavorful whiskey going into the barrel. You're not trying to get it as neutral as you can coming off the still. So, our we tried a lot of different proof points coming off the still, and obviously, we can control points off the still. And so we kind of settled in at 137. Obviously, the federal regulation is can't be distilled to 160 proof or more. It has to be 160 proof or less. So 137 is lower, and it gives us a very flavorful new make whiskey. I'm not sure if you were able to try our new make when you were in town, but I feel like our new make is phenomenal. It has a natural sweetness to it, and so we felt like at 137 that showcased our whiskey better than any other proof point. So like when I'm looking, I don't get to do a lot of the fun things in the distiller anymore. I'm mostly, brand advocating the brand and trying to grow the footprint for distribution. But, one of the things I look for on our production reports is I'm looking to see what exit proof we're coming off the still at. And I would rather it be 135 than 141. And so we try to keep it under 140. And so we just kind of determined 137. One of the things that we didn't talk about, but is kind of integral in our process is the sweet mash. We use a
Mhm.
sweet mash process versus sour mash. And, that's giving us a different profile off the still as well. But, we try to let the whiskey dictate what we do, and we don't try to force it into uh, into a box. We try to do what's right by what we feel like. We try to do what's right for the whiskey as we view it. And so, that 110 um, proof point into the barrel, the reason we did that, and that came from Wilderness Trail and Pat Heist and Shane Baker as well. So there's a historical context for it. They didn't do it for the historical context, but the historical context was before Prohibition. The barrel entry proof limit law was 110. So that goes into producing into that pre-Prohibition style that we like to pursue. The reason they did it is Seagram's, which used to be their plant was where MGP is now in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. And so I want to say they did these studies in the 90s, could have been even earlier than that, is they broke down a lot of the whiskey production industry scientifically. One of the studies that they did was the study of the molecular maturation of whiskey as it relates to proof point. And so they took whiskey at 125, filled multiple barrels, 124 multiple barrels, all the way down to 100. And they studied what was going on inside the barrel with different proof points and how that was interacting with wood sugars and all the rest of it, and extraction rates and all the rest. And they found that at 110, you were getting more extractions of vanillins and caramels and things like that, and really a more efficient use of the barrel. But you end up buying more barrels because if you go in at 110 versus 125, you're putting less alcohol in the barrel, so therefore you buy more barrels. If we were doing things on economy of scale, we would go in at 125 because we buy less barrels. But we feel like that's there's reasons why those are the two main reasons we do that.
Just as a side note here, as someone who's formerly in financial services, do you ever think you'd be this excited by the scientific points of whiskey maturation?
Oh, absolutely not. It's funny, man. My initially it captured my imagination from a cultural heritage standpoint, and then what we call the backwoods chemistry aspect of it. And that's something that started to capture my imagination as well. The fact that back in the Middle Ages, really distilling, you're taking three inert ingredients being grain, water, and yeast, and a contraption and turning that into something flammable, which is pretty wild. Distilled spirits are the only things as humans that we ingest in our bodies that's flammable. And it sounds crazy, but it's a flammable consumable.
Yeah.
And so the chemistry behind that is something that it always amazes me. So yeah, it's fun.
So I know we don't have too much time left with you, but a couple of points I wanted to hit just to make sure we cover everything. And again, the website has a ton of information on there. And before I forget, you can order bottles. Well, first you should go to the distillery. That's the number one thing. If you can't go to the distillery but you like the products, you can get it in 39 states now, which is a wonderful thing. Uh, and there'll be a link to obviously the website and things in the show notes for where
Absolutely.
you can find it. I wanted to jump back to a portion of the process that we just touched on, which was that Lincoln County process
Hmm.
for the Tennessee whiskey. So not for the Tennessee bourbon, you're not using it on all of your whiskeys.
No.
Uh, so the just as a quick reminder, the definition of the Lincoln County process is pretty vague. It's pretty open. It just has to be
Yep.
filtered through sugar maple charcoal. Doesn't say how long, how much, how fine, coarse, nothing else. It's pretty out there. So you're doing it through about 5 feet because
Hmm.
in your words, you wanted to say if you're gonna do it, you want to do it, do the process justice. Um, and at least in 2019, you were making your own sugar maple charcoal. Do you still make your own?
Absolutely. Yeah, and you're right about that. Once we decided we were going to make Tennessee whiskey and being, grain to glass, our hands touch every aspect of the process. It was important for us to make our own charcoal, and there was a little bit of learning curve. We had some batches that, unlike I felt like on the whiskey side, the charcoal, it took us a little while to dial in that process, but we
Did the
have
fire department have you on speed dial
no,
at that point?
no, we never had anything like that. But we do have we're lucky to have a sawmill about 5 miles from the distillery called Fox's Mill, and so as his foresters bring in sugar maple, Tommy Fox will cut that into 2x2 staves for us and air dry that for about 18 months, and so when we get that sugar maple, we actually take that wood to my farm where we live on now, and we use whiskey off a run that's obviously very flammable to start the fire with. It's a very natural process. Don't use any kind of petroleum based accelerant or anything like that. And we learned the technique that if you let the top burn, while you kind of put the bottom portion out with a water hose to keep that charcoal from turning to ash, it eventually just burns itself down with controlling it with the burn with water and a really nice charcoal. And so, we could have done something simpler. There's actually a company out of Quebec, Canada, called Basque, where you can buy pure sugar maple lump charcoal. And a lot of people will run that through a chipper just to kind of to make it a little finer for more contact with the whiskey. But our deal is, hey, we wanted to use local Tennessee timber for that, and so it's a little bit of a laborious project, but our distillers love to do it. It's fun. We make an event out of it, and because we're a bottle and bond distillery, we make Tennessee whiskey for half the year, we make bourbon for half the year. So we start every batch of Tennessee whiskey with a fresh batch of charcoal, and and so yeah, it's a fun process. But as you know, and probably your listeners know as well, I mean, the only difference between the only reason Tennessee whiskey is not bourbon is because Tennesseans don't want it to be. That sounds kind of like a smart ass answer, but it's really true. The TTB, when we're filling out our production reports every month for the TTB, there's not a box for Tennessee whiskey. It all goes into bourbon.
Mhm.
And so, but yeah, that's the only differentiation. You make bourbon in the state of Tennessee, and before it goes into the cask, we're filtering it through sugar maple charcoal, and it takes our whiskey about 36 hours to travel down through the charcoal. Everybody has their own different process, and they're all kind of nuanced in the way that they approach the charcoal mellowing. But for us, that's the way we do it.
And this was, you know, For me, the Lincoln County process can kind of be uh, divisive for a couple of reasons, but one of them being the question of whether it's a reductive process or not.
Hmm.
So it for me, just putting my opinion out there, it's reductive in the literal sense. It is removing things from the distillate. So yes, it's literally reductive. However, if used correctly, whatever that means, it doesn't have to take away a ton of flavor or a ton of the oils. And I often give the example of with Jack Daniels. Obviously, that's kind of the example people go to. But if you visit the distillery, you see the huge vats. It's 10 feet of charcoal and takes I think 2 days to go through that. And um, so you have a reductive process then, and then you get the most of their products right off of that. But for the Gentleman Jack, they put it through another 3 feet. And I used to really enjoy that. And I tasted it again a couple of years later, and I was like, there's no finish to this. This feels so light.
Yeah.
And I get it. That's what they were going for. And someone, the tour guide even said, like, we've designed this to not have a finish. Exact verbatim words. And
Wow.
I almost just looked at him and was like, you didn't really mean to say that, did you? Like, you want to, I mean, I get it. Maybe you can say it's a lighter thing, it's a lighter style. You don't want it to like weigh you down or something, but to say you don't want to finish, that doesn't sound right. So, so for you, um, as I said, you want to differentiate without taking too much flavor, but for you, it sounds like it just makes it different, not necessarily lesser or worse or better. It's about a different experience that is unique to Tennessee.
Absolutely. And one way, obviously it does have like we talked about, it has a subtractive effect to the whiskey. It's removing some of the heavier oil compounds and fusels and things like that. But one thing it's doing as well, which is probably a little less talked about, is there's a little bit of a imparting of calcium that occurs, as you're making that charcoal. So the whiskey is picking up a little bit of calcium, which is alkalinity, which lends itself again to softness and I dare say smoothness. And so it's a little bit, if you try our that distillate before pre filtration and post filtration, it's different. It has a softness to it, has a tinge of, and I don't want to use the term smokiness but it has a little element to that, which is masked by the barrel once it goes into it. But it's definitely manipulates that whiskey, and obviously, the Tennessee's history with the Lincoln County process, charcoal mellowing. Back in the old days, it was called leaching, which doesn't sound very, very appetizing to consumers. But that's a process that was really, if you go back and think about those 322 distilleries in the state in 1896, all of those folks weren't using the Lincoln County process. It really became indicative of Lincoln County, where Jack and then that area of Tennessee, kind of southern Tennessee, and then Robertson County, where Nelson Greenbrier, where Charles Nelson started Nelson Greenbrier. Those were kind of the two areas that were using it. Most of the people in the state were making what would be considered bourbon, and so after Prohibition, the only two distilleries that made a comeback because of some legal issues. Tennessee, 3 counties in Tennessee were the only ones that adopted distillation back in their counties after Prohibition. And it just so happened to be where that charcoal mellowing or Lincoln County process was prevalent, and so that became how Tennessee whiskey was shaped as far as a whiskey standpoint goes. But charcoal mellowing with whiskey goes back. It really just charcoal mellowing of any kind of liquids goes back from time immemorial through human history. I remember being over at the Glengoyne Distillery north of Glasgow, and they talked about back in the old days they would filter their whiskey through charcoal and river moss. And so it's a technique that's been used in whiskey production probably since its inception, probably. And it just became indicative of Tennessee distilleries because of the two players that really made it out of Prohibition.
Definitely. So as we are wrapping up the story here, I realize that I have missed something that's kind of a big thing to miss in this situation. So you worked with Wilderness Trail, and we haven't really talked about your fermentation. Any weird yeasts or fermentation methodologies that came out of working with those guys?
Obviously that with Firm Solutions was the parent company of Wilderness Trail, really. But so working with them was very interesting. And I would say no. Obviously, we use a strain of yeast that's been used with wheat whiskeys in the past, and so I kind of leaned on. We went through probably different five different yeast strains before we settled on the one we're using. And obviously, yeast strains will impart some nutty flavor to whiskeys and things like that. But we felt like the yeast that we're using complements what we're doing across. We make Tennessee whiskey and bourbon in equal amounts, and then a little bit of rye whiskey every year. And we actually use the same yeast strains for all three of those. We don't use a different yeast strain for those three different class and types. But I've been very happy with the profile that the yeast is adding. As far as our fermentation, using the sweet mash process, using sweet mash, we have to be uh, more cleanly in the way that we perform our mash cooking and set up our fermentations. It's a gentler style of mash cooking. We're not, for one, we're not adding any back set or spent stillage to our mash water, which sometimes that back set and spent stillage can contain a little bit of bacteria. And obviously, bacteria competes with yeast for sugar consumption. So we have to be super clean in our mash cooking and fermentation setups, and because we're not bringing that mash water to boil like a lot of distilleries do in a traditional sour mash process. A lot of distilleries will bring their mash water to boil, introduce their corn, bring it back to a boil, and then start chilling and adding their different grains. With our sweet mash process, we're only heating to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. All steam goes off. We start introducing corn at 200, comes to rest around 190, which is the gelatinization temperature of corn. So because we're not boiling that water, we have to make sure our everything is very clean. And our fermentations have been, we're and this is getting in the weeds a little bit, but
Go for it.
we
We
on
can
our
handle it. Go for it.
our starch conversions, we're hitting 20 bricks pretty consistently. Our target bricks is 18, and we're getting 22 to 20 bricks going into fermentation, which as a small distillery gives us more volume
Mhm.
coming off the still. So using that sweet mash process, it is a gentler form of cooking, mash cooking, but it can also end up biting you if you're not super clean in your vessels and whatnot. But I love the sweet mash process. I think it gives, it's creating a higher pH because you're not adding that acidic backset to your mash water. So you're starting with a higher pH just intrinsically, and that carries across all aspects of the process, even through maturation.
And I asked this of everyone who uses the sweet mash process. You use wood fermenters. Uh,
Yes.
any thought to doing the stainless steel just to help with that cleanliness?
Absolutely. So we actually replaced one of our cypress fermentation tanks with stainless steel, and I don't want to. I listened to a talk given by another distiller that's in the industry that's very iconic for using cypress fermentation tanks. And they actually, behind the scenes, they're using stainless steel, and they have some closed top fermenters as well. And so they've actually done a pretty intensive study on the difference between cypress wood fermentation, stainless steel open top fermentation, and closed top fermentation. And obviously, in the distillery, you have a microbiome the same way our bodies do, and there's good bugs and bad bugs, and those good bugs ending up become part of your profile of your whiskey, and contribute to a signature kind of taste. And so they found that the difference between cypress fermentation and stainless steel fermentation was pretty much negligible because they were both open top. They found a vast difference with in the content of microflora when they went to closed top. So they weren't getting the same amount of microflora in those in that closed top environment, and so that kind of prompted me to go to change one fermenter over to stainless steel, and it's just a lot more. Those wooden vessels, they're like a ship. They're all a wooden ship. They're always trying to sink or leak. So we'll probably slowly replace those. We clad them in wood just for aesthetics, but I've just got one stainless steel. But I've loved our cypress fermentation tanks, but they are a pain in the ass. I'll tell you that.
That's what I've heard. So just to close out the final topic that I have for you, I want to give you a minute or two to talk about a philanthropic aspect of the distillery. So this is
Sure.
the Freedom and Whiskey Foundation that you guys talk. So the floor is yours.
Absolutely. Well, we do a lot in the. I tell we do a lot in the charity space, and I tell people that I'm whiskey rich and cash poor. I'm trying to change that dynamic, as the distillery gains age and distribution footprint and whatnot. But we have historically done a lot of things with charities. We also work not only with Freedom Whiskey, which I'll talk about, but we do a lot of stuff with Scott Hamilton's CARES Foundation, which is cancer research. Do a lot of things in the anti-human trafficking realm as well. But yes, Freedom Whiskey is a veterans-based charity that we started at the distillery. It's actually benefiting special operations veterans coming out into retirement. A lot of these guys and girls, are retiring at 41, 42, and they're in the special operations community, and they speak multiple languages. And there's a lot of money earmarked for wounded vets and Gold Star families. There's not a lot of charitable dollars earmarked for people that are relatively sound and wanting to find a new industry or kind of find their way in life after they retire. And so Freedom Whiskey kind of helps them do that. We help fund advanced scholarships. Folks want to come out and get an advanced degree, we help fund that. We also do professional networking. If they have a business idea or they're looking for job placement, we help them with that. We also help with entrepreneurial support. So building business plans, pro formas, financial modeling, help them get tied in with starting their own business. So it's been rewarding, and we're doing some good work within the special operations community. And it's not when you're dealing with wounded vets, there's a lot of heartstrings attached to that. There's not as much heartstrings with attached to what we're doing at Freedom Whiskey, but it's still meeting a need for these folks that are highly motivated, highly intelligent, and looking to do something with the second part of their life. So we kind of help them bridge that gap.
It's fantastic work. I don't have any military connections myself. The last generation of my family to be in the military was my grandparents' generation, World War II and Korea. So it's been quite a while, but there's something that's always appealed to me about that transition to civilian life and the transition of skills that they've learned over decades in the military. Often they come back and there's not a lot of support, as you said. So I really appreciate that and want to give you a few moments just to talk about that and to make sure that is known. So we'll have a link directly to that as well in the show notes if you want to find out more about it, about the Freedom Whiskey Foundation, and in addition to your other philanthropic ventures that you mentioned. So with that, I know we have covered a lot tonight for Leiper's Fork Distillery, Tennessee whiskey, Tennessee bourbon, rye. Notably, I just want to throw this out there. Notably, no gin or vodka. All whiskey.
We're a whiskey house. Yep.
Your whiskey house have been from the beginning. But with that, Lee, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and talk about Leiper's Fork. I do hope to come down there again sooner rather than later, and just spend a little more time. I was definitely kind of rushing through when I was there, so I didn't get the experience that I know now that I should have. So I will definitely take advantage of that next time I'm down there. Hang out with me for just a minute after we finish recording.
Absolutely.
So
Well,
this
I
has been another
appreciate you
episode.
having. Look, I
Oh, yeah,
appreciate you having me on, and would love to host you at the distillery next time you're in the Middle Tennessee area. We'll crack some of these tap some of these experimental barrels, and have some fun.
I'd love nothing more. And you heard it here, folks. There's audio proof. Uh, so I'll hold you to it. With that said, this has been another episode of the Whiskering Podcast. Thank you everyone for listening, for liking, subscribing, reviewing. Listen to watch out for the show notes. Listen to the end credits for more information, and I'll see you all next week.